Let your eyes grow heavy as we drift to a quieter Egypt, where the Nile moves like a long, unbroken breath. Tonight we follow a gentle tale of Isis and Osiris, a story of devotion, loss, and the slow return of order. Nothing rushes here. The reeds hush the wind. The river keeps time. We'll move carefully, simply, letting the rhythm soften the mind. If sleep comes, let it. The story will keep watch for you. We begin far before kings and temples, where silence was everything. And from that silence, the first stirring of the world rose like dawn. Before there were names, there was the endless water, the quiet, dark expanse called Nun. No shore, no sky, no noise except the idea of becoming, hosted in a stillness so complete, it felt like a cradle. From that hidden depth, a mound lifted, slow and patient, as if the water remembered land and brought it back. On that first hill stood the first light, the first warmth, a presence you could sense like morning sun on closed eyelids. From this beginning came Atum, or Ra in his earliest breath, the self-begotten spark. He spoke, and his words shaped space. He exhaled, and air was born. He wept, and his tears became living beings. With each small act, the world gathered itself. Air and moisture appeared as Shu and Tefnut, a pair who moved lightly across the newborn horizon. They wandered the young distances until, like travelers returning, they found their way back to their source. From them came the ground we can touch and the ceiling we can see. Geb, who is earth, and Nut, who is sky. They loved each other so closely that the world felt compressed, sky and soil pressed together like two hands clasped in comfort. But Shu, who is air, rose between them and lifted Nut upward, arching her into a vault of stars. In that gentle separation, space to breathe was created. Day could stretch, night could rest. The first rhythm began. Nut, the sky, arched over the world in a calm, endless curve. Geb rested below, rich and quiet, holding seeds that had not yet awakened. Between them, the places of life opened. The Nile found a bed to move through. The wind learned to travel. In this wide space, the gods could walk, speak, and shape things with care rather than haste. From Geb and Nut came 4 children, companions who would anchor the human story to the divine. Osiris arrived with a presence like harvest, the sense that effort leads to fullness, that order has a gentle weight. Isis followed, alert and wise, the thread that mends, the voice that remembers the right words at the right time. Set came too, the rush of storm and the hard edge of desert wind. Not evil, but difficult, the test that reveals what endures. And Nephthys, soft as evening, a keeper of thresholds, the friend who stands beside grief without speaking loudly. Each of them took a place in the pattern. The sun learned to cross the sky and return by night beneath the earth. The moon lightened darkness without waking it. Stars set their paths, patient and repeating. The ibis watched the flood rise. The heron waited on one leg. Papyrus lifted their green spears along the banks. The world settled into laws that felt like lullabies. The first temples were not of stone. They were groves of tamarisk and stands of reeds, open courtyards of sky. The priests were simply those who listened closely to wind and water, who placed offerings on clean rock and whispered gratitude to the horizon. With time, hands shaped adzes and baskets, and voices named days. The year learned the rhythm of the river, swelling, retreating, resting. At the center stood a promise the gods kept with us. That order, called Ma'at, would be upheld if we walked gently and kept faith with simple things. Bread baked well, fields watered on time, truth spoken plainly. In that promise, Osiris would come to mean the green crest of life, the calm judge, the steady current. And Isis, the hand that steadies the lamp in a soft room, the quiet spell that mends a broken thread. This is where we begin, in the serene unfolding of a world from water and word, the golden age of Osiris. When the world was ready for steadier days, Osiris stepped forward with the quiet weight of harvest in his hands. He didn't seize a throne. He took it the way a field takes water, by absorbing it, by giving it back. The land recognized him. People felt it in the ease of their breath at dawn, in the sound of grain heads brushing each other like a soft, continual prayer. Osiris taught gently. He walked the banks and showed hands how to shape channels so the Nile's gift would linger in the soil. He knelt in furrows and pressed seeds into cool earth, not as a command, but as an invitation. Wheat rose, barley followed, flax opened into pale flowers that moved like quiet thought. He spoke of seasons as if they were neighbors, the time of swelling water, the time of sowing, the time of reaping, the time of rest. Work became a rhythm that didn't exhaust. It steadied the heart. He brought law the same way, not a hammer, but a line drawn smooth. He said truth lives best where it can be spoken without fear, where a wrong can be made right before it grows sharp. Elders sat beneath palm shade and listened more than they argued. Disputes found endings that felt like level ground under bare feet. People slept through the night and woke calmly because they knew where they stood with one another. Houses learned to face the breeze. Doorways met the morning first. Hearths stayed small and steady. Bread rose on cloth, and clay jars grew cool in shallow pits lined with damp sand. Children carried baskets with both hands and learned the names of birds before they learned the names of gods, because Osiris taught that both kinds of names matter. Isis stood beside him, not behind. She understood the pattern beneath the pattern, how words could tie loose ends, and how silence could mend a wound better than argument. She watched the stars and kept a lamp lit for the hours when thought wanders. When sickness came, she whispered over water and pressed linen to hot skin until fever loosened its grip. People said she knew the hidden names of things, but she never displayed them like a treasure. She kept them the way you keep a friend's confidence. Together they walked the fields at dusk. Osiris lifted a handful of earth and let it fall in a soft thread. Isis watched the dust settle and spoke the small spells that keep anxiety from rooting in the chest. Their bond made the land feel held. Even the cattle chewed more slowly. Boats returned earlier. Songs grew lower and rounder as night came on. Temples began as clean spaces. Thresholds swept, jars of water set to one side, a plate of bread and a pinch of salt. Priests learned that order isn't strictness. It's care repeated daily until it turns into peace. They traced ma'at on the floor with reed ash and then wiped it away, knowing that the act, not the mark, mattered most. The feather of truth stayed light because lies didn't find many places to land. Travelers carried news that sounded like good sleep. Fields farther south were green. A well had sweet water. A family had settled a quarrel and shared a boundary stone carved with a simple spiral. None of it was grand. All of it endured. That was Osiris's rule, durability instead of display. In the evenings, when the river wore the color of copper and figs cooled in baskets, Osiris told stories of beginnings, not to claim them, but to remind everyone that the world had started well. Isis braided those stories into lullabies, adding the names of stars so children would feel the sky listening. The moon rose, slow and round, like a careful promise. Under their care, Egypt didn't shine brighter. It breathed better. And the breath of a whole people became a quiet, dependable tide, the shadow of Set. But balance always carries its counterweight. Where Osiris's steps softened the ground, another rhythm gathered along the edges, where the fields met the dry breath of the red land. Set lived there, in the raw spaces where seed won't take and wind doesn't bend. He wasn't a villain carved in sharp lines. He was the grit that keeps wheels honest. He was the test. He watched the river hesitate under cloudless heat and understood a different truth. That comfort can dull the senses. That soft paths can hide weak roots. In the glare of midday, while others slept, he paced the high dunes and studied the way dust swirled and settled. He learned the language of storms, how a gust could pry loose a careless roof, how one unguarded embankment could give the flood a wild idea. Set loved the straight line of challenge. He loved the clean cut of a blade through knotty wood. He valued toughness, the kind you can't chant into being. Where Osiris saw the long piece of seasons, Set saw drift, vulnerability, the first hairline cracks at the edge of a jar. He wasn't wrong. He simply stood at another angle. Still, envy is a quiet silt. It settles in any slow water. People praised Osiris in market talk and evening songs. They spoke Isis's name, with the soft tone reserved for safety and cure. Set heard it carry on the air, always drifting away from the desert and toward the green. He told himself that order took his strength for granted. He told himself that storms train trees, that without abrasion, polish never appears. Yet the voice under those reasons said something smaller. Why not me? The brothers moved differently through the same world. Osiris lingered and listened. Set arrived like a gust, tested the latch, checked the joinery, pointed at the weak post, and asked why it stood at all. One calmed, one probed, one knit, one pulled. Most days, those motions balanced the fabric. But sometimes, after long stretches of praise for peace, the probing hand feels ignored, and the pull grows harder. You could feel it when the hot months held too long. Dogs panted under shade and stared into the bright, as if expecting something to rise from it. The river fell quiet a day longer than usual. Boats listed on mud. Set read these signs like a craftsman reading grain. He spoke to few, and when he did, his sentences were efficient, questions clipped to points. Have you tested that sluice? Do you know where the bank will fail? If the wind shifts at night, will your fire move? People nodded, thanked him, returned to their ease. Contrast sharpened at the family table. Nephthys, evening soft, could sit between them and turn tension into a shared breath. But even she felt the line tighten. Isis rarely argued. She would pour water and tilt the conversation towards small gratitude. Set heard the curving of her words, the way they wrapped sharp edges and made them smooth. He mistrusted smoothness that arrived too easily. Whispers began, not yet of rebellion, only of a different vision. Some hunters liked Set's certainty. Some builders admired his eye for failure. And in Set's chest, a plan didn't form so much as a mood, a pressure to demonstrate, to show the land what it owed to dryness and wind. The horizon looked nearer. The green looked fragile. The air tasted of change, like iron under the tongue before rain that never comes. The deceptive feast. Set chose a path that looked like celebration. Not a march, not a clash, a feast. He sent word along the river that a grand evening would honor the season, the smooth harvest, the calm weather. He knew people would come for music and bread, for cool water poured from tall jars, for the chance to sit in one another's company. He knew Osiris would come, because Osiris met gatherings the way the Nile meets its banks, naturally. For days, Set moved with careful intent. He called craftsmen with quiet hands and asked for a chest to be made. a container shaped to seem like a gift. He asked for cedar dark as evening, inlaid with gold that didn't shout, only glowed softly at the edges. He measured with a glance, the way a hunter judges distance by memory. He studied his brother's cloak, folded on a stool, the line of his shoulder when he bent to trace a mark, the span of his hand when he lifted a cup. He didn't touch. He learned by seeing. The artisans worked in a shaded court. Their tools made a modest music, plain, rasp, cloth rubbed with oil. Set never raised his voice. He hummed once, an aimless note that ended before anyone could call it a song. When asked if the chest should be carved with stories, he said no. Let it be simple. Let it sit like an answer that explains itself. Evening came. Lamps were lit in niches along the walls. The courtyard filled with low conversation, with the quiet shuffle of sandals, with the sound of fruit being peeled and placed on platters. Musicians brought flutes and a small drum with a heartbeat pace. The air cooled by a degree you could feel on the inside of your wrists. People greeted one another with the mild relief of day's work done. Osiris arrived without guards, as always. He greeted the eldest first, clasped hands, asked after a son's marriage, after a cousin's knee. Isis moved beside him, not in his shadow, but in his circle. She met eyes. She set anxiety down with a few words. Set welcomed them with an open palm, with the patience of a host who has planned too well to show haste. He offered dates and a chair that faced the breeze. At the center of the court, under a woven canopy, stood the chest. It looked like calm made solid. The wood's grain ran like river lines. The hinges didn't squeak. People admired it the way they admire a well-made jar, not for extravagance, but for rightness. Set clapped his hands once, a soft sound that drew attention without breaking the mood. He smiled the way a craftsman smiles when a piece is complete. He said, "Let's play a game to mark a good season. Whoever fits in this chest with the ease of rest will have it, a gift for the one whom calm suits best." Laughter rose, gentle and brief. Men and women took turns, lying down, finding a corner too tight, a length too short. Jokes stayed kind. No one strained. The night held its even tone. When a child reached to touch the gold, Isis lifted 2 fingers and the child stopped, not frightened, just reminded. Set watched without blinking too long. He waited. He let the air cool further, so breath would slow and muscles soften. Osiris stepped forward when others had turned away with a shrug. He didn't compete. He tested nothing. He simply looked at the chest as if it were a bed prepared for a weary traveler. He asked, "May I?" Set bowed slightly. "Of course, brother. Let the maker of ease try ease." Osiris lay down. He fit as water fits a cup. His shoulders found the corners without strain. His knees bent an inch, then loosened. A murmur ran through the room. Not surprise, only recognition. It made sense. The chest had the logic of his shape. Set moved then with a speed he had practiced in stillness. The lid closed in a single smooth arc. The sound wasn't loud. It was a soft meeting of wood to wood, like a door settled for the night. Iron clamps slid into place. Nails tapped, quick and neat. Resin sealed the seam in a shining line. For a breath, no one understood. The action had no raised voice, no thrown cup. Isis stood. The room tilted around her while her face stayed steady. She said Set's name once, not as a cry, as a statement. He looked at her and held her gaze without speaking. The musicians had stopped. Even the night insects outside paused between chirps. Servants, already directed, already waiting for this silent signal. Lifted the chest, 4 corners, 4 hands, the weight, the warmth within. They moved toward the open gate, toward the street where a cart waited, toward the river that receives everything. People didn't block them. They hadn't named what they'd seen yet. When the mind doesn't have a word, the body stays still. Isis reached the procession at the threshold. She set her hand on the chest. Her palm felt the heat of life through the wood. She spoke a word too low to be language, a thread pulled tight at the base of the throat. Set touched her wrist, almost gently, and then didn't. He stepped back. The servants passed. The night carried them to the bank. Water lapped with its usual rhythm, unaware. The chest slid into the river with a sound like a long exhale. It took the current, turned once, twice, then moved as all things move when the Nile decides. Lamps on the shore made small paths of light across its lid, then lost them. Behind, the feast stood without a center. Bread cooled, fruit dried at the edges. Conversations would later return and try to name the moment, to assign intentions, to draw lines. But there, in the immediate after, there was only the empty space where a body had been, and the soft, persistent sound of water carrying a secret away. The fateful moment. The river accepted the chest the way night accepts a final word. It floated low, steady, a dark shape wearing a thin skin of lamplight, then drifted beyond the last reeds and the last voices. On the bank, the hush broke into fragments. Questions spoken too softly to answer, hands reaching halfway and stopping, sandals shifting on grit as if a different arrangement of feet could undo what had begun. Isis didn't move for a long breath. Stillness was a raft, and she used it to cross the first narrow channel of shock. When she turned, the courtyard seemed unreal. The cloth canopy hung without a meaning. The chairs were only chairs. She walked through the wake of the moment, past fruit that would never be eaten, past water that would never be poured again for this purpose. Set stood beneath a lamp. The flame made a small, reliable cone of light on his shoulder. He didn't speak. His silence said the choice was complete. It didn't ask for agreement. Isis left without ceremony. Her feet found the street, then the slope, then the path, where beaten earth becomes wet sand. The Nile was a long exhale, unhurried, bearing the sealed weight toward darker distances. She followed along the bank, the way you follow a thought you can't set down. She didn't call. She knew wood doesn't answer. She kept the river in the corner of her vision, watched the gleam on the lid appear and vanish as the current turned it. Osiris, inside, lay with the calm of a man who had trusted the room. The first tightness had loosened when he felt the lid come down with that soft, final sound. After the iron and resin, his breath had learned a new pattern, short, measured, careful not to spend too much of the thin air. He placed his hands on his chest and counted heartbeats. He listened for Isis's voice through wood, through water, as if a syllable could pass like light through thin cloth. He found only the small creak of planks, the intimate sound of his own lungs. On the shore, Isis knelt and washed her hands in the water. It was a simple act, the kind you do before lighting a lamp or tending a wound. She did it to set her mind. The coolness reached her wrists and steadied the tremor that had begun at the base of her thumb. She stood and walked again, keeping pace with the chest as far as the path allowed. When a thicket of papyrus blocked her, she stepped into the shallows and let the reeds brush her knees. Small fish flickered. The river didn't change its mind. Behind her, people began to speak Set's name in tones that tried not to break. No one shouted for gods. No one knew where to aim their urgency. The feast had been an invitation. The ending was a fact. Facts don't soften when pushed, they hold. Night cooled. Stars gathered in their known places, indifferent and faithful. The moon lifted its roundness like a bowl of milk, steadied by a patient hand. Isis felt the pull of both, distance and care. She followed until the bank rose too high, until the ground cut away into blackness where feet would slip. There she stopped. She placed 2 fingers to her lips and lifted them toward the river. A small old sign carried through families for luck and safety. She kept her voice inside her mouth. Words, once thrown, can't be gathered. A breeze came from the east, gentle, just enough to raise the fine hairs on her forearms. It pushed the surface grain of the water, not the body beneath. The chest made a slow turn and continued, obedient to the central current. It would reach the wide water. It would meet distances she couldn't walk. Isis accepted that boundary without surrendering to it. Acceptance here was a kind of breathing that didn't spend hope. She stood until lamps went out behind her, and the insects resumed their counting. Then she turned back, not to rest, but to prepare for motion. The house would need to be closed. The small jars would need covers. The travel basket would need a coil of rope, a skin of water, a knife wrapped in linen so it wouldn't speak against itself. She would need a cloak for cold and a scarf for sun. The simple list held her like a low wall in a flood. As she walked, footsteps approached and slowed. Nephthys appeared at her side without announcement. Her face carried evening's patience. No questions. Only a closeness that made space instead of filling it. Isis inclined her head. The two moved together, matching pace, turning the corner, passing the gate where the lamp still burned, as if waiting for a guest who'd gone to fetch something and would be back soon. Set remained in the courtyard, hands at his sides, eyes on the pattern of shadows the lamp cast on the smooth floor. He had chosen a clean line. Clean lines cut. He listened to the low murmur of people trying to place themselves again after furniture has moved in the dark. He said nothing. The night ended as all nights do, by continuing until it didn't. And the river kept its promise, carrying the sealed quiet toward a horizon that receives every story before it returns it changed. The river's journey. The chest slid past familiar banks and into stretches where the river widens and voices thin. The Nile's back was smooth tonight, a broad muscle moving under a silk skin. Reeds bowed as it passed, not in alarm, only as they always do when water decides. Little eddies touched the corners and let go. Fish rose once and drew a small circle that closed without a trace. Villages thinned. Lamps became fewer, then single, then none. The river learned its larger shape again, away from the hems of fields and the neat edges of gardens. It gathered darkness the way cloth gathers folds, gently, inevitably. The current, patient as always, carried the sealed weight as if it were an old story returning to its source. A barge creaked somewhere upstream, then faded. The chest drifted low between islands of scent. Mud, lotus, the faint sweetness of crushed papyrus. A heron lifted, slow and careful, and took 3 wing beats before committing to flight. It watched from above, marked the square of moving shadow, then turned to a brighter strip of water, and forgot. The river forgives quickly. Stars leaned into their reflections. The chest, wearing a thin gloss of starlight, turned with slow accuracy toward the middle flow. It didn't hurry. The Nile doesn't reward haste. It rewards alignment. Even sealed wood can find that. Toward midnight, a wind from the inland desert skimmed the surface and stitched a line of ripples across the channel. They whispered against the lid and moved on. The sound was private and small, like linen brushed by a careful hand. Beneath, Osiris felt the river's language in shifts of weight more than sound. A gentle lift at the stern, a settling at the bow, a pause that meant shallow ground nearby, then the deeper pull. He let his heartbeat borrow the rhythm. It made time easy to hold. Farther down, where banks open into marsh, papyrus built green walls with quiet rooms between stems. Frogs counted patiently in uneven numbers. Fireflies stitched bright marks and unstitched them. The chest slipped through a corridor of shadow and pale bloom. Once, it touched a root with a soft, wooden hello and moved away. Nothing took offense. By dawn's first grey, the water broadened. The river, preparing to think of sea, relaxed its shoulders. Salt lived far ahead, but the thought of it was already present, the way a coming season exists inside the current one as a faint taste. Boats that worked the lower reaches lay on their sides at moorings, waiting for wind and hands. Nets hung like quiet rain between poles. The chest passed and made no claim. Day rose without argument. The lid wore a thin warmth. Birds discovered the morning and folded it into wings. The current showed its bright spine. And then, as the banks flattened and the river's voice changed from long vowels to open breath, the chest met a pull that widened every motion. Estuary, a place of mixing. The Nile loosened its hold and offered its carried things to the wider body. Out there, a different blue waited, slow and immense. The chest entered with a small lift, like a sigh taken at last after careful breathing. Fresh met salt, and the seam between them blurred kindly. Tides spoke in long sentences. The chest listened, turned, and let the sea place it on a path along the coast toward a foreign shore that would not yet know what it had received. The grief of Isis. Morning didn't arrive with brightness. It arrived like a hand laid gently on a shoulder that already knew the message. Isis wrapped herself in a plain cloak and let the house fall behind her without closing its eyes. Doors can watch for you. She needed both hands free for the long, patient work ahead. She chose the shape of a mortal woman, the way a river chooses a narrower bed when it must pass between stones. Power sits better when it's quiet. Her sandals found the packed dust of the road, and the world met her without ceremony. A stray dog asleep, a clay jar drying on a step, a reed mat rolled and leaning against a wall. Nothing changed to accommodate her grief. That steadiness helped. She walked where the Nile had walked. Along banks that remembered the chest, she asked questions she didn't speak aloud. The water answered in motions, not sentences. A curl along an eddy meant no. A smooth stretch meant yes. But past here. She touched the tips of reeds and felt their light shake, travel into her bones like a small, persistent drum. It kept her moving. Her sorrow didn't break into cries. It widened and grew shallow, like floodwater that covers fields in a thin, shining sheet. Every blade of grass wore it. Birds carried it in the angle of their wings. Even the sun seemed to respect it, softening its edge as it climbed. She ate dates without tasting them, sipped water because the body asks, regardless of the heart's occupation, and then walked again. She spoke to trees because trees stand still long enough to hear. Sycamore, tell me if a wood passed. Palm, did you shade a floating square? Tamarisk, you know how to hold a secret. Has one brushed your roots? The groves moved slightly, leaf against leaf, making the mild hush of small answers. Not yet. Farther. Keep going. Children saw her and didn't fear her. They stepped aside with a careful politeness, taught at thresholds, and watched her pass the way. One watches a cloud that might bring rain, or might simply cool the air. Women rinsing cloth paused their hands in the water and looked at her face. They recognized a kind of work. They nodded once, a greeting that doubled as a blessing. At midday, when heat rests like a lid over everything, she found a shade and let her breathing lengthen. In stillness, the world brought her murmurs. A trader speaking of a ship from a northern harbor. A fisherman telling a friend about a night when the tide carried a strange box past the mouth of the river. A rumor of a tree in a foreign town that grew too quickly and made the street smell sweet after rain. Small stones, dropped without thought, but she heard the ring. She rose and thanked the shade like a host. She walked to the shrine at the road's bend and set a small loaf on the cool stone, not to bargain, but to keep the habit of gratitude alive while sorrow tried to thin it. She washed her hands. The water dried quickly on her wrists and left faint lines of salt. It felt like a map. That night, under a round, obedient moon, she lay on a mat outside a stranger's door, because strangers in this land offer corners to the weary. Sleep came in pieces. Each fragment carried the shape of a lid closing, then opening into sea. Between those pieces, a whisper passed along the track of wind from north to south. Byblos, it said without saying. A tree, sweetness in the air. She opened her eyes to the dark and knew the road had changed direction within her. The whisper from Byblos. Morning thinned the stars and left a pale road. Isis stood, gathered her cloak, and followed the thread she'd heard in the night. Byblos. The name rested in her mouth like cool water. She walked toward the harbors where traders speak in layered voices, where winds braid languages together until meaning rides on tone more than words. Rumors travel on small feet. At a way station, a woman pounding grain mentioned a tree in a city by the northern sea. It had sprung up in a single season, tall beyond the roofs, sweetening the streets with a fragrance that calmed sick children and made tired men sleep through to morning. No one could say why it grew so fast. No one could ignore it. Even letters sent south carried a shadow of its scent. Also, the sender claimed. Isis listened the way you listen for a river under sand. She asked nothing aloud. Questions make stories run. Silence invites them to settle. In the marketplace, fishermen spoke of a smooth, square trunk at the heart of the royal hall, wrapped with bands of gold leaf, cool to the touch, but warm at dusk, as if a heart inside remembered sun. The king's workers had raised it as a pillar after a storm felled it near the shore. Since then, people said, the city's fevers broke more easily, and the sea's temper had softened. She let the clues align. A chest carried north, a tree that rose too quickly, a scent that healed and settled the mind. Fragrance travels through wood. Wood drinks stories. A tamarisk can hide what it chooses to keep. The thought moved through her like a tide, changing without hurry. On the road, caravans overtook her and then fell behind. Drivers clucked to donkeys, wheels creaked, and bells on harnesses ticked out a patient count. News repeated itself with small changes, like a song sung by different mouths. In one telling, the tree wept a balm that eased coughs. In another, it glowed faintly after rain. She didn't sift for perfect truth. She waited for the parts that stayed no matter who spoke. Byblos, a tree, sweet air, rest. At a shrine near the desert's lip, she sat while the wind wrote low lines in the sand. A pilgrim shared dates and told her how ships in that port set out and returned with cedar, with purple cloth, with jars of oil sealed like secrets. He had stood once outside the palace and smelled the pillar's breath, milk-warm, clean, steady. He dreamt well that night, he said, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest and set on a shelf where it couldn't fall. Isis thanked him and moved on. Hills rose and folded. The sky widened into a calm that asked nothing. When she met the sea, its flat blue spread like a long-held silence made visible. She followed the coast, letting the salt air lay its cool hand on her face. By evening, the city's walls showed themselves pale against the dark. The wind carried a thin sweetness, not flowers, not spice. Something like linen washed and dried in steady sun. She paused at the gate. The scent was faint but persistent, threading through the tar of ships and the smoke of cooking fires. It settled the breath. It felt like recognition. She entered quietly, as a tired traveler would, and the city welcomed her with a slow nod of lamps being lit one by one. Somewhere at its center, a tree held its secret. And the secret called her by a name only the river and the wood remembered, the court of Malkander. Byblos woke gently, and Isis moved toward its center, where stone streets narrowed and voices softened. The palace of Malkander rose without threat, a careful stack of courtyards and shaded galleries open to the sea's breath. Guards watched with the calm of men whose days rarely break. She entered as a stranger would, cloak plain, gaze lowered, steps unhurried. The scent grew stronger here, clean, patient, like warm wood after rain. A columned hall opened like a cool mouth. At its heart stood the pillar she had come for, tall and smooth, banded in restrained gold. It lent the room a steadiness you could feel in your ribs. Servants moved around it instinctively, skirting clothes, brushing the air with their sleeves, like moths passing a lamp they trust not to burn them. Isis didn't reach for it. She stood at a respectful distance and let recognition rise in her like tide. Malkander the king entered without parade. He wore quiet authority, a linen tunic, a ring that caught light and then forgot it. His queen, Astarte, walked beside him with the still grace of someone who listens before she speaks. They looked on the stranger with polite interest, the way householders look at a traveler who carries no dust of trouble. Isis bowed as a woman weary from the road does. No flourish, only gratitude for a place to stop. A steward asked her name. She offered one small and local, a borrowing from the market's talk. The queen's eyes rested on her with kind attention. Are you hungry? A question that opens a door. Isis answered softly, only for work. The court understood that answer. Work weaves strangers into fabric. She was led to the inner rooms where women sit and mend, where jars are sealed, where a child's cry is met before it becomes a call. The queen's infant son lay in a basket lined with woven reed and soft wool. He breathed with the uneven rhythm of new life, sometimes catching, sometimes sighing. Isis knelt and placed her hand above his chest, not touching, only shaping the air. His breath found a steadier line. The nurse looked at her with relief she didn't want to name. Quiet competence makes quick friends. Days found shape. Isis rose with the first pale band of morning, helped grind grain, rinsed linens in cool basins, whispered lullabies that named the hours and smoothed their edges. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice carried the weight of someone who has carried heavier things. The queen watched the way the child settled in her arms, the way fevers fell back before her cool cloth, the way the room seemed to remember its own purpose when she entered. In the public hall, the pillar held court with a silence that comforted. The king rested his hand on it while hearing disputes. Fishermen dividing a catch, merchants sorting numbers. Decisions came easier near it, as if the mind could stand straighter in that scent. Malkander credited workmanship and cedar. Isis passing with a tray, closed her eyes for a heartbeat, and saw the chest within, cradled by tamarisk heartwood, held like a memory bound in bark. At dusk, when the sea laid a silver path to the horizon, the child grew fussy. Isis wrapped him and walked the shaded colonnade, counting steps under her breath, a number that matched the resting pace of tide. The boy's tears thinned, then vanished. The queen followed, unannounced, and watched the small miracle that looks like nothing but sleep arriving correctly. "You have hands that calm," she said. Isis smiled. "Hands learn from the heart that guides them." Trust grows in households by repetition. A wet cloth wrung just right. A jar sealed exactly when it should be. A word spoken at the right height so it lands softly. The court learned her by these. Children of servants reached for her. Old women offered her their quiet, approving nod. Even the cats brushed her ankles and then lay down as if the floor had warmed. Once, late, when the hall emptied and lamp wicks glowed like the last thoughts of a long day, Isis stood before the pillar. She didn't pray. She remembered. She stood with her breath level and let love make a space around her where grief could rest without waking. In that ring of stillness, the wood answered with a warmth that wasn't heat, a presence that said, "Not lost, held." The king, waking early, saw her from a distance and felt no alarm. He saw a faithful woman greeting the day's first quiet. The queen, coming to lift her son, felt gratitude open in her chest like a window catching a breeze. And so Isis stayed, a steady figure in rooms that prized steadiness, drawing nearer to the secret she had followed across river and sea, patient as tide, exact as breath. The tests of the goddess. Nights in the palace settled like clear water in a bowl. In that quiet, Isis measured a different work. The prince slept, but his sleep rode lightly, a leaf on small currents. She knew the old ways that turned sleep into something stronger. She waited until the lamps were coals. She carried the infant in her arms, wrapped in linen that remembered the sun. In the inner court, where the stone floor held the day's warmth, a brazier glowed with a small, even fire, the kind that eats darkness without smoke. Isis stood before it and breathed until her body matched the flame's calm. Fire is a gate when kept correctly. She lowered the child over the glow, not into flame, but into the circle where heat purifies. She spoke words that sit in the oldest layer of speech, the ones that invite weakness to loosen and leave. The prince's breath paused, then steadied. His limbs softened. In that moment between warmth and cool, old mortality thins. Each night, she would bring him close to endurance, then back, leaving the husk of frailty behind like ash too fine to see. The first night, no one watched. The second, a curious nurse drifted to the doorway and saw only a woman and a child wrapped in calm. The third night, the queen woke from a dream of wings and went to find her son. She entered the court and saw the scene in a single breath. Her baby over fire, the stranger's hands, the glow. Fear arrived like a bell struck hard. "Stop!" The word rang. The sound broke the thin shell of stillness. Isis drew the child to her shoulder in one motion and turned. The queen's eyes were wide and full. The nurse behind her covered her mouth. In the small turbulent air that followed, the baby shifted and made a soft sound that wasn't distress. He slept again, as if set gently on a deeper shelf. Isis didn't argue. She stepped back from the brazier and stood in the middle of the court, the child warm against her. When fear fills a room, explanations are brittle. She chose revelation, the simple kind that doesn't bend. "Look," she said, and let the cloak fall from her shoulders. The air around her lifted, as if the room itself took a breath it hadn't known it needed. Her outline brightened. Not glare, not lightning. A quiet radiance. The glow wood gives when held near flame long enough to remember it. The Queen's terror paused, listening. Isis spoke, and her voice carried the cadence of river and reed. I came to heal, not to harm. I would have burned away the parts that break easily, so he could walk longer in this sun. She stepped closer. The Queen felt warmth that soothed rather than seared, and in that warmth, her fear found a place to sit down. Malkander arrived with guards who saw no enemy, and lowered their spears without being told. He looked from his wife's face to the child's calm mouth, then to the woman who seemed both traveler and temple. He bowed his head slightly, a host recognizing a guest whose name is older than his house. Forgive my haste, the Queen said, voice unsteady and honest. I saw the edge and thought it was a fall. Isis nodded. Edges are for crossing when held. I would not have let him slip. They asked her name. The true one. She gave it lightly, as if placing a small lamp on a table. The room understood. Awe arrived, but it didn't shout. It stood quietly by the pillar like a witness who won't leave. That night, they did not set the child over the brazier again. Some lessons, once interrupted, are better folded away. Yet the boy slept as if the work had completed itself. The Queen, now knowing, watched Isis with a steadier heart, and the king watched the pillar with new ears, hearing in its scented silence a promise he hadn't known to ask for, the request for the pillar. Morning laid a pale band across the hall, and the pillar wore it like a quiet sash. Isis stood before Malkander and Astarte with her cloak gathered loosely, presence softened, voice steady enough to hold water. She didn't command. She asked as one who has carried long distances. I've come for what the tree holds, she said, eyes resting a moment on the smooth trunk. Inside this pillar lies a chest that belongs to me, and to one who trusted a room that did not deserve it. The king's brow folded, not in refusal, but in care. This pillar steadies our court, he said. It sweetens the air. Our disputes end faster when hands rest upon it. If I loosen it, the room may forget its balance. His fingers touched the banded gold as if listening for counsel. The pillar answered with the same warm, patient scent. Astarte stepped closer to Isis and lowered her voice. You steadied our son, she said. If a house owes a debt, it should be paid. But tell me, if we give this, will the blessing go with it? Blessing follows purpose, Isis said. This wood has been kind because it has been kind to someone within it. Kindness won't vanish. It will change rooms. The court gathered like reeds leaning toward a current. No one spoke above necessity. The king looked to his guards, then to his workers, men with hands trained to separate what seemed single. If we agree, he said, we must do it cleanly. No splintering, no rush. He turned back to Isis. If we find what you seek, what then? I will take the chest home, she answered. I will take it to a place where marsh grass hides the moon. There, I will do the work that time denied me. Silence held long enough to make the choice clear. The king nodded once, a decision balanced on gratitude and the simple arithmetic of gifts received. Bring tools, he said. Bring cloth. Bring oil. We will not bruise what has served us. They wrapped the base in linen soaked with warm water to soften memory from bark. They loosened the bands without tearing, each strip caught and laid aside like a sentence preserved. Their artisans cut with slow breaths. The fine saw, whispering through layers that had pressed themselves tight around a hidden heart. Resin wept a little. The room answered with that clean, milk-warm fragrance. Stronger now, familiar to Isis the way a remembered name is familiar. At last the tamarisk opened its arms, and there, seated within the cradle it had made, lay the chest. Cedar dark, edges true, lid sealed in a shining seam that daylight could not cross. The hall did not gasp. It exhaled. Isis stepped forward and placed both hands upon the wood. Heat lived there, not of fire, but of held presence. She closed her eyes. The distance between breath and body vanished. Gratitude rose, simple and full. She lifted her head and met the king's gaze. "You have returned what the sea borrowed," she said. "Your house will keep its calm. It isn't trapped in timber." They packed the chest in linen. Workers set the pillars cut ends smooth, filled the gap with a new trunk, seasoned and shaped, a quiet successor. The scent in the hall softened, but did not die. People stood easier, understanding that steadiness can move and remain itself. Isis bowed to a starter. "Your son will sleep," she said, "not because a pillar stands, but because love repeats its duties." Then the gates opened, and with the chest cradled by careful hands, she began the long return toward the river that remembers every story, the return to Egypt. She left Byblos before the streets were fully awake, the chest wrapped in linen, bound with ropes that remembered gentler tasks. The sea waited, blue and deliberate. Sailors, paid in full and thanked by name, lifted the burden without question. They felt the gravity in it that wasn't only weight. The boat nosed out past the breakwater, found the wind's slow shoulder, and leaned into distance. Days at sea passed like well-counted breaths. The hull hummed, the masts sighed. Gulls marked the border between hunger and home. Isis sat near the bow with her hand resting lightly on the wood, listening for the small language of creak and shift that carried news from inside. She didn't speak to it. Presence was enough. At night, stars wrote their calm script across the dark. She read only the part that pointed south. When the coastline softened into familiar lines and the Nile's mouth gathered them in, the boat rose as if relieved. River water carried a different quiet. Reeds thickened. The air changed, losing salt, gaining the low sweetness of silt warmed by sun. Men at the oars let their strokes lengthen. The boat slid into the green corridors, where the world narrows and the mind follows. Land again. Quiet berthing in a cove, known by fishermen and birds. The chest came ashore on shoulders that had carried grain and newborn calves. Isis stepped onto the damp sand and felt Egypt rise through her feet like warmth. She bowed her head once, not to the ground, but to the thread that had held firm from feast to foreign pillars to this shore. The marshes of the delta opened like a book written in patient script. Channels curved softly. Hummocks of papyrus lifted their narrow hands. Herons stood with the skilled stillness of old priests. Isis guided the small procession into a place where paths are more memory than trail, where sound falls soft and secrecy grows naturally, the way shade grows under a broad leaf. They found the thicket she wanted, tall stems, woven lattice, a shelter that looks accidental until you notice how it doesn't move in wind. There, between water and firm earth, they laid the chest upon reeds, cut fresh and spread like a clean cloth. The men stepped back. She thanked them with bread and a nod that said more. They left without turning to look again. Everyone understood what privacy means when it protects love. Isis knelt. She ran her hands along the seam. Resin held, tight and true. The lid was warm with the day's collected kindness. She didn't open it. Not here, not yet. Magic likes order as much as it likes intention. She set small jars in a row. Oil pressed from olives, water carried from pure springs, natron salt that dries tears and cleanses equally, linen woven by careful hands who knew it would touch a king. She breathed the marsh's breath, green, damp, humming with small lives. Hope flickered, not as a leap, as a steady lamp set behind a screen. She would work when the moon was high and the night's surface settled. For now, she would guard and wait. Secrecy wasn't fear. It was shelter. She whispered to the reeds, to scorpions under stones, to the wind that slides between blades. Keep this place unseen. Bend the path away from wandering feet. Hold quiet like water holds a reflection. The marsh answered in the only way it knows, by thickening shadow, by softening footfall, by turning the loud world into a far shore. A moment of hope stood beside her, not loud, not fragile, prepared, the betrayal in the marshes. Nights in the delta passed like a slow hand across still water. Isis kept her vigil with the patience of someone weaving a long cloth, one thread, then another, never tugging too hard. Reeds held their breath. Frogs measured hours. The chest lay on its bed of fresh-cut stalks, warm in the day, cool in the deep night, constant as a sleeping heart. She guarded, she gathered, she prepared. She spoke to no one but small lives that know how to keep secrets. Set hunted when the moon was full. He liked the clean edges the light draws. Shadow here, silver there, no confusion, no muddled midtones. Alone, with a spear that remembered straight throws and a knife that didn't chatter. He walked the margins where land pretends to be water, and water pretends to be land. He listened for the sounds that reveal carelessness. A snapped stem, a foot that doesn't understand mud's pull. The marsh spoke in fluent quiet. He understood enough to move where it allowed. Chance is a kind of listening. A heron, startled by something neither threat nor friend, lifted too soon, its wing brushing papyrus hard enough to make a dry whisper. Set paused. Air shifted. There, a thinner shadow, a shape that wasn't a hummock or a fallen mat. He crouched and held his breath until the marsh resumed its soft sentences. Then he moved closer, each step a question the ground answered yes to. He found the thicket that doesn't move in wind. He saw the cut reeds woven into a mat too even for accident. He saw the small jars, their order modest but exact. And at the center, the chest. Cedar dark, edges true, the seam shining faintly where resin meets moon. The air around it was different, cleaner, steadier, as if the place had learned a deeper way to be quiet. Set stood very still. He recognized the weight inside without needing to lift. Memory lives in wood. His jaw set, not in rage yet, in recognition of a line he had drawn once and now saw crossed by love's persistence. He felt admiration like a spark, quick, bright. Then he closed his hand around it until it died. Admiration softens. He had come to be stone. A ripple touched his ankle. He turned his head. In the slow water behind him, a small scorpion rode a leaf. It floated past, tail curved, indifferent. The marsh had accepted all guests tonight. He looked back at the chest and let the hunt's focus settle on it like a hawk's shade. He didn't shout. He didn't call men. Clean lines like quiet. He slid the knife from its sheath. The blade's back touched his palm with the familiarity of a long tool. He tested the seam with the edge. Light, precise. Resin held. Good craft. He nodded once. An honest gesture to an honest seal. Isis felt the change at a distance. the way a room feels different when a door opens soundlessly. She rose from her crouch among reeds and became air. The path bent, the papyrus leaned, but direction is stubborn when intention is a straight spear. By the time she reached the thicket, Set had his hand on the lid. "Brother." Her voice arrived like a hand offered to steady. He didn't look up. He answered without words, pressing the blades flat along the seam to judge its patience. He nicked it. The resin parted with a faint, sticky sigh. The lid lifted the width of a breath. Isis stepped forward. Her palm touched wood. Warmth moved between them, hers from guarding, his from will. They stood like that, not fighting, pressed against a single decision. The marsh waited. Set shifted weight. The lid opened. Inside, the quiet presence that had taught rooms to be rooms lay in its careful stillness. Osiris, preserved by love and sealed craft, wore the calm of one who had accepted the world's last word and prepared to answer it differently. Set's throat tightened. He cut the feeling in half. Rage arrived then. Not loud, not blazing. It was the hard, cold kind that hates what it cannot make. He pulled the lid fully. He lifted Osiris as if lifting a heavy certainty, and the night took that weight as if it had been expecting it. Isis reached, not to stop him. This was beyond hands, but to hold the moment, to keep it from cracking into shards too small to gather. "Let me finish," she said. "Let the work return him to where he belongs." Set looked at her, finally. His eyes held wind and grit. "He belongs where I put him." No shout. A statement laid flat like a blade. Then he acted with the brutal order he trusts. Knife, clean, cuts, counted, 14 pieces, set apart on reed, on mud, on the slow water's edge. He scattered them with a hunter's map, north, south, east, west, to shrines, to fields, to bends in the river that remember names. The marsh bore witness. Frogs fell silent, then resumed, because life resumes. The moon carried its circle, indifferent to arrangements. Set stepped back, chest empty now, work finished in the way storms finish. Nothing left to rearrange. He left without looking behind. He prefers straight paths after ruin. Isis knelt among what remained. She lowered her head until her forehead touched the reed mat. Breath came, thin but even. Grief didn't break her voice. It refined it. "Then we begin again," she said to the night, to the river, to every city that would soon be asked to remember. She gathered one piece and wrapped it in linen. The work had changed shape. The promise had not. The second quest begins. Dawn arrived without colors, just a soft lifting of dark from the marsh. Isis folded the first wrapped piece close to her heart and stood. The ground under her feet felt like a slow drum. Determination borrowed its beat. She called quietly, and Nephthys came, stepping between reeds like someone returning to a familiar room. Sister to sister, they didn't exchange explanations. They shared the work in a glance. Nephthys knelt and took another piece, her hand steady, her breath matching Isis's. Together, they laid out linen, made neat bundles, tied knots that would not slip, even when carried long. A jackal watched from the edge where shadow meets water. Yellow eyes kindled, then softened. Anubis, keeper of thresholds, came without ceremony, the way night comes, completely, and then you realize it has been here a while. He lowered his head in greeting, not to be worshipped, but to join. His presence dried the sharp edge of fear. Where he stood, the air remembered order. "We need a craft that leaves no splash," Isis said. Nephthys answered by cutting fresh papyrus, each stalk chosen for length and pliant strength. They laid stems in opposing rows, wove with strips peeled thin, pressed them underfoot until the bundle held together like a firm thought. Anubis set his weight along the spine, testing balance. The little boat rose slightly, then settled true. It would bear love without complaint. They slid it into the narrow channel. It accepted them the way a hand accepts another in the dark. Isis placed the first small bundle beneath a woven screen. Nephthys steadied the stern. Anubis trod the shallows, a silent escort. The reeds parted with an instinct older than speech. They set a course that wasn't a straight line. Straight lines waste the wisdom of curves. River law says, follow the bends, listen to the pull, trust the backwater when the main flow argues. Each city, each nome, each shrine would receive a quiet visit. They would not announce. They would ask. The land would answer in stories that remembered too much to be wholly wrong. Isis marked the first stop with a palm on the water. Here, she said to the current, hold our path. A heron lifted and nodded once, as if agreeing to carry the message upstream. They poled with even strokes. Reed beds gave way to open lanes. Mud banks offered discreet landings where footprints vanished before the next hour. People met them along the way. Fishermen with nets across their shoulders. Women with jars balanced like small moons. Children curious, but trained not to crowd grief. Isis asked less with her mouth than with her presence. A thing was lost, her eyes said. Have you felt the ripple? In one village, an old man pointed toward a grove where the air felt thick with memory. In another, a child brought a palm frond with a feather laid upon it, not understanding why, only knowing it mattered. Nephthys kept a map in her mind, a constellation of places where Set's path might have broken like pottery. Anubis sniffed wind, earth, water, reading the invisible. At each landing they left no mark, only a grain of natron at a threshold, a knot of reed at a cornerstone, a blessing shaped like breath. Isis's voice stayed low and calm. We will gather all, she said to the river, to the boat, to her own heart. We will not hurry. Haste breaks what hands can mend. The boat moved on, a simple shape carrying exact purpose, beginning a journey meant to touch every edge of a kingdom and sew it, piece by piece, back into one. The search for the limbs. They began where whispers converged. A bend in the river where fishermen laid out nets to dry offered the first sign, reeds tied in a ring, drifting against a root as if guided to a pause. Anubis stepped into the shallows, lifted the ring, and beneath it, wrapped in silt-soft linen, lay a hand. Fingers curved as if still blessing morning bread. Isis rinsed it in clear water, the way you rinse a thought before speaking it. She anointed the palm with oil and laid it in a basket lined with fresh-cut papyrus. Nephthys bound the bundle with a quiet knot. The river made a small approving sound against the hull. In the next nome, a grove of sycamore wore a hush that wasn't shade alone. Children played at its edge and didn't cross the line where leaves began to speak softly to one another. Isis entered and listened. At the trunk's base, where roots gripped like old hands, the earth had been disturbed, then leveled with care. She pressed her fingers into the soil and felt a coolness that remembered a resting weight. They dug with wooden spatulas, not to bruise. From the cradle of loam, they lifted a foot, slender, bearing the fine dust of journeys not walked. Nephthys washed it with water poured in a thin thread, as if filling a small, precise shape. Anubis wrapped it with linen that held the scent of sunlight. Stories guided them more than maps. At a ferry crossing, an old woman offered a bowl of barley and said a dream had told her to keep watch for guests, seeking what the careless scatter. She led them to a shrine where a local tale said a king's knee fell from the sky and landed under a stone that never warmed. They touched the stone at noon. It was cool. They lifted it with care. Beneath, in a pocket of still air, lay the knee, quiet, patient. Isis smiled without showing teeth. Truth leaves small fingerprints, she said. They found a shoulder where floodwater lingers longest, as if the body remembered resting beneath a tree after work. They found a rib near a place where women sing while pounding grain, the rhythm aligning with the rise and fall of breath. Each discovery came with a local name, a festival, a custom of leaving bread, or a single flower. People had made meaning to hold the absence. Isis didn't correct anything. She thanked every myth as a helper and moved on. Anubis's nose read the world's underspeech. He paused at a reed bed where wind carried a faint sweetness like resin cooled in shadow. There, tucked among stems, lay another piece, clean as if the water itself had washed it and set it aside. He placed it in Nephthys's hands without words. Their work didn't need praise. It needed steadiness. At a desert's edge, where stones remember heat longer than they should, a jackal's trail crossed theirs, then doubled back as if to guide. They followed to a low cairn, 5 rocks arranged with intelligence. Under it, they lifted a forearm that seemed to carry the weight of harvests taught and shared. Isis traced a line down it with oil and whispered thanks to the hand that had held this land so gently. Not every search ended with a find. In one town, people told of a piece taken by priests to honor the god they knew. Isis entered their temple with uncovered grief and left with empty hands and a blessing offered anyway. "Hold what you hold," she said. "We will make a whole from what remains." Wholeness doesn't always mean every part returns. It means nothing that returns is refused. They moved by moon when heat would have thinned patience, by day when doors would open. Birds marked turns. Ripples answered questions. Nephthys's mind map grew bright. Here a hip, here a shoulder, here a fragment that remembered the curve of a smile in bone. At each place, they left a token. An ankh pressed once into damp earth, a line of natron, a whisper of Ma'at's name. At last, their baskets were nearly full. The boat rode lower, not burdened, anchored by purpose. Isis placed her hands over the gathered bundles. "We have enough to begin," she said. The river stilled in agreement. They turned toward the marshes, carrying a body retold by love, ready for the quiet craft that would teach it how to stand in light again, the magic of reassembly. They returned to the marsh thicket where secrecy grows like shade. Isis and Nephthys laid woven mats on damp ground, then set each linen bundle in a calm, deliberate circle. Anubis stood just beyond, where the reeds begin to shiver in any stray wind, a boundary made of breath and intent. The river quieted itself as if listening. Isis opened the first bundle with hands that had learned the right weight of touch. She didn't hurry. She unwrapped as if waking a sleeper who must not be startled. The hand lay there, rinsed by earlier rites, oiled. Still, she placed it lightly upon a rectangle of clean linen, and beside it, the forearm, the upper arm, each set in order the body remembers even when silence has held it long. Nephthys moved like a second thought that confirms a first. She warmed oil between her palms, an oil steeped with frankincense and myrrh, until the scent held both sunlight and shadow. She traced the old pathways of feeling, wrist to elbow, elbow to shoulder, teaching skin and bone the lines they'd loved. "Find one another," she whispered, not command, invitation. Love prefers invitation. Anubis brought natron in a shallow dish, grains dry as a wise word. He pinched it between finger and thumb and let it fall along edges that would meet, drawing clean borders where union would occur. Salt listens. It draws out what should leave and leaves behind what should remain. He worked in silence that felt like a hymn without voice. They aligned pieces on a reed mat chosen for its even weave, a simple grid to guide the eye. Isis spoke names for each part as she touched it, not as inventory, as acknowledgement. Shoulder that bore harvest baskets and offered bread, rib that housed breath shared in laughter, knee that bent to greet children and stand before petitioners. Naming drew threads across the space between, fine and strong. Spells came next, old words from the layer of speech that predates quarrel. Isis chanted low, a river note, steady, repetitive, the kind that polishes stubbornness into acceptance. Nephthys answered with a softer counterline, a harmony that filled the small spaces the main tone cannot reach. Anubis's voice entered last, deep, brief phrases that seal agreements. The marsh heard and didn't intrude. Linen waited in long, pure strips, woven by women who had been told to keep their hands kind and their thoughts steady while the loom sang. Isis dipped the edge of a strip in warm oil and laid it across the first joined seam, smoothing from center outward so nothing trapped air. She wrapped in spirals that overlapped just enough, each pass a promise to hold. Nephthys followed with a second layer, thin and exact. The body learned enclosure again, but this time a shelter, not prison. They set amulets where meanings converge, a wadjet eye at the brow, watching both the seen and the unseen, a died pillar at the spine, reminding it how to stand, a tired knot over the heart, a looped ribbon of protection that says, "Be held." Anubis placed a scarab at the place where dawn gathers in a body, promising motion toward light. None of these glittered loudly. They rested like truths too old to perform. Between steps they paused to let stillness take its share. Work hurried is work untrusted. The marsh breathed around them. A small fish broke the surface, made a ring, and retreated. The ring expanded without fuss and vanished under new ripples. Even water offered an example of joining and passing on. When the limbs had learned one another's edges and linen had taught them how to stay, Isis kneaded resin with oil into a salve that smelled like clean wood and distant rain. She pressed it into the last narrow spaces, where skin once spoke directly to skin. It filled without swelling, agreeing without argument. Anubis lifted a palm, and the air within the reed ring grew cooler, as if a doorway had been opened onto a long hall. He nodded once. "The road is clear," he said, voice a felt stone rather than a sound. Isis bowed her head, then leaned close to the bandaged face she loved and spoke the simplest vow. "We will meet where breath returns." Night closed gently. The body, carefully reassembled, lay in linen whiteness, amulets resting like constellations. Nothing dramatic moved. That was its beauty. Order had been taught back into matter, and matter had agreed. The rest would be breath and time, and a pair of wings that remembered how to shade a world. The conception of Horus. When a body has learned order again, breath becomes the next guest. Isis stood beside the linen form and opened her arms. Feathers unfolded from her shoulders. Broad, dark, soft, with the sound of quiet rain. She became the kite, the morning bird, whose wings shade grief until it can look up. The marsh accepted the change without a ripple. She leaned over Osiris and fanned a measured wind, not a gale, a tide made of air. Downstroke, lift, downstroke, lift. Each motion pressed cool life across linen and drew it back, like waves rinsing ashore, leaving clarity where silt had settled. She spoke between strokes, a line of words that asked no struggle. Return as far as love allows. Return where promise waits. Under the wrappings, something answered, not a stirring, a remembering. The chest rose the width of a reed's thickness. The throat found the shape of breath again, thin at first, then even. Anubis bowed slightly. Nephthys closed her eyes and smiled without showing teeth. In that gentle air, Osiris moved from finished to changed. Isis lowered her face to the bandaged mouth and gave him her breath the way one gives water to a traveler who has crossed a hot day. Gift given, gift received. The room inside the wrappings became larger, as if a door had been opened onto a courtyard. No one hurried. The night stayed kind. She folded her wings and knelt. Words came that do not belong to public halls. They were small, exact, and warm. They called him by names used when work is done and bread is shared. They told him of the river's patience and the boat that never leaked. They told him of a future carried in a seed that would need a guarded shore. Osiris heard, not with ears but with what listens after hearing is unnecessary. His presence lifted like dawn lifting from a field. He did not return to footprints and sunlight as he had known them. He turned toward another throne, one that rests beneath the western horizon where the sun walks at night. The duat opened, calm as a long hallway, with lamps already lit. He stood there, alive in death, king where endings are weighed and sent on. But before he stepped fully into that rule, love asked and was granted 1 hour of nearness. Isis drew a veil of silence around the reed shelter, a soft cloak that set the world back 3 paces. Within it, she became the form that welcomes creation. He became the answering stillness. Linen did not hinder. Boundaries are kind when purpose is clear. A spark passed, quiet as a seed settling into earth no wind will trouble, no trumpet, no flame, just certainty finding a place to grow. Isis rested afterward with her palm over her belly, feeling a pulse that wasn't hers, light as a finger tapping on the far side of a door. She closed her eyes and breathed once, deep and even. The marsh breathed with her. Osiris rose in the realm that had accepted him and took his seat among fields that never fail. He would teach the dead to remember balance. He would judge hearts against a feather that refuses to lie. He looked once more through the thin veil that separates brightness from its reflection and knew the world would have an avenger. Isis stood, drew her cloak close, and listened. Reeds made a small hymn in a north wind. A heron's shadow crossed the water and did not break it. She turned toward the delta's deeper places, where secrecy lives easily and time walks softly. The child within her carried a name the land was ready to learn, the hidden childhood. The marsh learned a new heartbeat. Isis walked its narrow paths with one hand at her belly, then with a bundle in her arms, whose breath sounded like reeds whispering to a patient wind. Horus arrived in a hush. The world met him with small sounds, water against stalk, a wader's thin call, the soft click of insects finding each other in dusk. He slept where papyrus made a cradle. He woke to a sky that changed slowly and asked nothing. Secrecy grew into routine. Isis wrapped him in linen that remembered warmth and laid charms at the corners of their shelter. A small knot, red as pomegranate skin, a shell turned inward so it would hear approaching steps before they made sound. She drew circles in natron at dawn, at noon, at evening, teaching the place to stay closed while letting light in. Nephthys came and went like a steady tide, bringing grain, herbs, a laugh held low so it wouldn't carry. Their talk was work and weather, never name shouted, never anger fed. Circuit watched with her patient court. Scorpions nested in the dry thatch edges, tiny emperors bearing droplets of lesson on their tails. They patrolled the threshold, a quiet legion that knew the difference between child's foot and hunter's boot. At night, Isis would raise her palm, and the small guardians would glow faintly as if moonlight liked their armor. She thanked them with milk, left in shallow dishes, with crumbs of sweet bread. Protection is a conversation. Horus grew in the spaces between alarms. Isis taught him the reed's grammar, how to hold still until danger's breath passes, how to step so mud releases without complaint, how to listen for the difference between wind and intent. She traced constellations on his brow with oil, showed him how the falcon's eye rests on a horizon and then tightens to a single fish-scale glint. He learned without hurry. Children carry lessons further when they arrive at the right speed. Sometimes fear came near. A boat would scrape where it shouldn't. A laugh, too harsh for a fisherman's joke, would carry across flat water. Isis's hand would rise, and the marsh would thicken, paths becoming poems only she could read. Serket's clan would lift their tails, a line of small, poised commas, and the threat would find its sentence, ending somewhere else. Horus's games had purpose folded inside. He chased dragonflies to learn sudden turns. He stacked smooth pebbles to learn balance. He drew falcons in mud with a cut reed and pressed his palm to make a wink. When he fell, the earth taught him how to stand without noise. When he cried, the sound was brief and honest, then gone. Joy came often, at a frog's clean leap, at a fish flashing a silver lesson, at the first time a heron allowed him within 10 paces. At night, Isis told him a story shaped like breathing, a father made of steadiness, a river that remembers, a promise that walks in small shoes until they fit the one who wears them. She didn't say Set's name. She said, wind that forgets houses and sand that bites. He nodded, serious in the way children become when truth is simple. The boy slept, a hand open and empty. The marsh watched, and nothing loud approached. The sting of betrayal. The marsh taught caution, yet even careful places allow a slip. Late afternoon, when heat thins the air and minds grow a step slower, a line of traders poled nearby, careless with talk. One laughed about scorpions like dropped coals. The sound slid under reeds and reached Horus where he traced falcon feet in mud. He looked up, curious more than afraid, and wandered to the edge where the shelter thins. A small scorpion, gold brown, sat on a warm stone, tail lifted like a question mark. It belonged to Serket's quiet court, a watcher, not a hunter. Horus extended a finger, gentle, the way one greets a beetle. The scorpion felt a tremor of unfamiliar scent and, startled by a shadow passing overhead, flicked its tail in reflex. The sting landed not as malice, as a mistake. The boy drew in a breath that didn't smooth out. He sat, surprised, eyes wide, then closed. Isis felt the change as a chord going slightly out of tune. She turned, the world narrowing to one point, and gathered him into her arms. The mark bloomed pale, then red. Heat lifted under skin. His breath shallowed, a small bird fluttering against wicker. She whispered his name in the tone that calls sleep back from the wrong edge. The marsh leaned closer. Her cry was not loud, but it carried the shape of need perfectly. Ra, she said, lifting her face to the bright road where the sun walks. See this child, born under your light. Let your eye open here. The wind paused as if hearing. Sun touched water and made a narrow path toward them. Serket came, quick and precise, her hands cool, her scorpions fanning in a ring that kept panic from stepping inside. She examined the sting, nodded once. Venom speaks a language. We answer with the right grammar. Isis held Horus steady, his head against her shoulder, body slack, breathing a thin thread that snagged. A shadow like a clean feather crossed them. Thoth's presence arrives the way thought arrives, sudden, orderly, exact. He didn't step. He was simply there, a calm brought into a room. He looked, not with worry, with reading. "This is not punishment," he said. "This is a lesson with a sharp point." He raised his hand and traced small signs in air, letters that know how to settle into poison and ask it to behave. He spoke the spell that unwinds harm, each word fitting the next like joined reeds, each phrase laid with the care of a raft meant to cross deep water. The venom listened. It paused, considered, then stepped back the way it had come, leaving coolness in its path. Isis breathed with the cadence of the words, lending her steadiness. Serket pressed a poultice of ground leaves and milk upon the mark, binding it with a strip of linen that had known sunlight. Horus exhaled. The tight bird inside his chest loosened its claws and found a quieter perch. His eyelids fluttered, then opened to a narrow, patient world. Thoth lowered his hand. "Teach him this," he said softly. "Danger is not always a roar. Sometimes it is a small bright thing that asks you to touch. Curiosity must learn the border between learning and harm." Isis nodded. "He will learn vigilance that does not become fear." Ra's warmth softened, approval without speech. The sun continued along its old road. Serket's court settled. The scorpion that struck had backed beneath the stone and stayed there, still, tail low, forgiven by the quiet way forgiveness actually works, by not making a scar where none is needed. Horus blinked and lifted his hand, palm open, apology shaped like a child's gesture. "I won't reach so fast," he whispered, voice thin but honest. Isis kissed his forehead and drew him close. "You'll reach with seeing first," she said. Evening unrolled like a cool cloth. Isis held him until his breath found the deep, even line again. Thoth watched until the last flutter left, then inclined his head and was gone, like a thought completed. Serket gathered her small soldiers, and they clicked softly, a reassuring punctuation around the shelter. The marsh resumed its patient sentences. A heron lifted, slow, careful, choosing a new reed to stand by. In the hush that follows true danger, Isis traced a circle of natron wider than before and whispered a new rule over the threshold. Curiosity with eyes open, mercy with hands steady, vigilance that breathes. The lesson stayed. So did the love that taught it, the coming of age. Years stacked themselves like neat baskets. Horus lengthened, voice finding a lower shore, eyes sharpening into the falcon's clean focus his mother had taught. The marsh that once hid him now felt small, a kind room for a body that had outgrown doorways. He poled the papyrus lanes with a steady rhythm, shoulders learning the measure of oar and wind. Serket's quiet court still watched the thresholds, but their arcs traced admiration more than worry. Even the herons allowed 3 paces now. Isis let tasks expand. She sent him for herbs that grew at the edge where mud meets dry sand, for reeds of a certain thickness that sing when cut cleanly, for water drawn at dawn when the surface holds the sky unbroken. He returned without splash or delay, his choices precise, his steps teaching the ground how to be silent. Nephthys set harder riddles. Count the ripples when a fish rises. Name the wind by what it forgets to move. Find truth in the sound of a boat you cannot see. He answered with attention, not pride. Pride is loud. He stayed quiet. One morning, the river held a mirror so smooth it felt like a blessing. Isis handed him a small blade of flint and a feather from a hawk that had shed it without struggle. 2 tools, she said. This one parts matter, this one parts doubt. Learn where each belongs. He tested both in air, then on habit, cutting stems with the stone, cutting hesitation with the plume, setting decisions in order as if laying amulets. Strength found him without making a show. He could lift the reed boat one-handed to clear a bank, yet he still moved slow when a frog slept across his path. His laughter arrived more often, but softer, as if he knew sound carries farther than intent. He practiced the falcon stance at dawn, feet planted, gaze far, then narrow, then far again, breath a rope between both. At night, Isis told the story that had waited inside all the others. She didn't hide names. She said Osiris the steady, Set the breaker, the chest, the scattering, the gathering, the breath that returned as far as love allowed. Horus listened with his jaw still, the way a bridge listens to water. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he asked one question. What does balance want from me? She smoothed oil on his brow. Not rage, not haste. A hand that knows when to close and when to open. Word of his growing reached beyond reed and sand. Fishermen spoke of a tall boy whose shadow didn't trouble the water. Ferrymen repeated a rumor that the marsh hid a falcon with a human stride. Even Set's patrols, sent at long intervals to test the delta's patience, found less than footprints, and those smudged into the general story of reeds. Choice arrived like a dawn that takes its time but cannot be delayed. Horus woke from a dream where a feather hovered above a heart and wouldn't settle until he breathed just so. He rose and found Isis watching the same horizon. It's time, he said. Not a shout, an agreement discovered. She nodded once. Nephthys stood in the doorway, hands full of linen that had been woven for this day. Circuits court lined the threshold, tails low, in blessing. The council of gods would need to be faced, not with noise, with presence. Horus took the hawk feather and placed it over his heart. Balance isn't a weapon, it's a measure. He stepped onto the boat. The river, remembering old vows, made a path that didn't argue. The tribunal of the gods. The hall of Ra was bright without heat, a place where light behaved like law. Pillars rose like calm decisions. The floor held a sheen that reflected feet without stealing faces. Horus entered with the pace he had learned from water, forward even, without splash. Isis walked beside him, linen quiet, presence steady. Nephthys stood back, a shadow that supports walls. Thoth waited with the poise of a finished sentence. Ma'at's feather rested on a low stand, unmoved by drafts that do not exist. The gods gathered as constellations gather, each in place, each with a story behind the eyes. Ra's gaze was the horizon itself, old, exact. Set arrived alone, shoulders squared, steps loud enough to be noted, not loud enough to be scolded. He looked at Horus the way dessert looks at green, measuring, not impressed. If fear visited him, it chose another day. Debate begins with breath, not thunder. Ra lifted a hand. We will weigh claims, he said. We will not weigh anger. The room accepted the rule. Thoth unrolled a slender scroll and drew a clean line from crown to soil. Succession, he said, when broken by violence, seeks repair in legitimacy and fitness. We will hear both. Set spoke first, words chosen like stones for a wall. Strength sustains order, he said. I hold the deserts back. I break what would rot the core. I killed my brother because softness had seated itself on the throne. Egypt needs a spine, not a smile. His mouth didn't curve. He believed himself. Horus answered with fewer syllables. A spine bends. It does not shatter. My father taught planting, not plunder. I will continue that. He didn't lift his chin. He didn't make a show. His voice found the space between defiance and petition and stayed there. Arguments multiplied like reeds, but Thoth kept them straight. Proofs, not performances, he said, writing each claim in tidy script. Set spoke of borders held against sand, of storms scattered. He named battles no one else wanted. He named nights in which he alone kept watch. The room acknowledged labor without blessing cruelty. Isis stepped forward, eyes soft, words precise. The chest, the murder, the scattering, these are not metaphors. They are actions. We repaired what could be repaired. We brought breath back as far as love allows. A child stands here because a wrong sought balance. He is not a claim. He is an answer. She didn't look at Set when she said murder. She looked at the feather. The gods murmured the way a city hums before a verdict. Hathor spoke of kindness that asks for nothing. Tar spoke of craft, how making requires patience and precision, not rage. Neith, old as woven night, said, arrows fly truest when the archer's heart is still. Every word was a small weight on the side of a scale that did not tip yet. Set countered with cunning. If birthright rules, then any infant may sit a throne while enemies sharpen knives. If sympathy rules, then tears are crowns. Egypt cannot be ruled by lullabies. His voice held iron dust. Horus did not answer that. Isis did. Birthright is the seed. Fitness is the rain. Both grow the field. She stood with her hands open. She offered nothing to fear. The room grew tired of talk without closure. Ra saw it. Words are roads, he said. We also need bridges. Thoth nodded. A contest then, not noise, proof. Ma'at's feather did not move, but the air near it felt like agreement. Set's mouth tightened, the pleasure of measurable trials touching his pride. Horus inclined his head, not eager, ready. Ra listed conditions. No trickery of witnesses, no harm spilled beyond the ring, no victory that ruins the field it claims. We decide by seeing, he said. Before they adjourned, Isis made one more small motion. She unbound a strip of linen and laid it by the feather. We have wrapped what was broken, she said. Let this remind us that power is the skill to hold, not to tear. Set looked away, as if the cloth irritated his eye. The hall released them with the hush of a temple at noon. Outside, the sky had the pale color of decisions in progress. Horus felt the weight of eyes and didn't change his stride. Set rolled his shoulders and filled his lungs like a bellows. Thoth closed the scroll. Ra's silence said enough. The contests would speak where mouths had tangled. The scale, patient, waited for motion. The first contest. The river Hippo. The river held its breath the way a crowd does when a door opens, banks lined with gods and witnesses. The ring was water wide and green, its surface smooth as a polished thought. Ra raised a hand, and Wind stepped back. Thoth spoke the rule so even reeds could understand it. Transform. Meet strength with strength. No blows beyond the river's skin. End when one yields or is bound. Set smiled with the desert's confidence. Water is a stage, not a home, he said. I'll break him where he thinks he glides. Horus answered with a single nod. He touched the hawk feather at his chest, then let it fall to Isis's steady palm. She closed her fingers around it. A promise held. They breathed once together, then shifted. It wasn't a flash of light. It was a decision given to shape. Flesh rounded and thickened, legs shortened, backs rose into bold hills. 2 hippopotami stood where 2 men had been, vast, slate-grey, muscle under river-wet hide, eyes small and sharp, ears flicking like small flags of intent. The crowd grew quiet for another reason now. Sighs asked silence. They slid into the Nile with almost no sound. Water accepted them the way a mat accepts heavy feet that know where to step. Set dove first, a shadow that liked depth, stirring silt into a fog that hides tusks well. Horus stayed near the surface, air and water meeting where balance lives. He moved with the minimalism the marsh had taught him. No wasted push, no splash that announces. He watched for bubbles, for the quick ripple that betrays intent. Set lunged upward, a grey mountain suddenly under light, jaws wide, teeth like pale sickles. He aimed to overturn, to crush. Horus turned, presenting flank where armor is thickest, absorbing force with a bend that gave back little. Water slapped hard, then mended. The crowd exhaled, then swallowed the sound. They circled, set dove again, trying the ankle grab, the pull-down suffocation, the deep place where panic does half the work. Horus answered with angle, with untaught patience, with a shove that wasn't fury, was geometry. Hip to shoulder, shoulder to waterline, a quiet way to say no. He bit once, not to tear, to mark, a ring of pressure that says, I can. Set snorted, spray like a brief rain, anger awake now, not clean. Minutes stretched long as reeds. Even Ra's gaze narrowed. Thoth counted with his thumb against his palm, not for time, for balance points past. Isis watched without blinking. Breath matched to Horus's surfacings. When he sank, her chest softened. When he rose, it steadied. She didn't whisper. Words disturb water. Set tried cunning. He nudged Horus toward shallows where mud holds feet past reason. Horus felt the give change under him and shifted broad, spreading weight, becoming a raft instead of a spear. The trap failed without drama. Set's irritation flashed as a tail slap that sent rings to the far bank. Hathor's eyes softened. Ninth's mouth held a line that approves precision. At last, force met the small limit endurance always sets. Set's next rush came a fraction slower. Horus felt it the way a bird feels a wind drop. He moved early, caught the neck with a sideways press, pushed down, not to drown, to hold. Set thrashed, water trumpeting around them. Horus maintained a steady pressure, not increasing, not gloating. Thoth lifted his hand. Enough, he said. He is held. Set stilled. Pride is strong. Lungs are honest. He yielded with a sharp exhale, angry, alive. Horus released and slid back, letting distance soothe. They rose, shedding hippo shape like heavy cloaks. Men again, breath high, eyes clear. Ra's voice carried without volume. Seen. Ma'at's feather did not move, but the air near it grew certain. The second contest. The stone boats. The river became a workshop. Banks lined with watchers. Ra named the task in a voice that didn't bounce. Cross the water in boats of stone. No sinking, no swimming. Reach the far mark upright. Thoth added the line that matters. Make with your own hands. No spells that mock material. Craft is part of truth. Set walked to a slab yard where masons keep their patient squares. He chose granite that remembered mountain weight and liked resisting. He laughed once, short. Let him drown in his cleverness, he said to no one and to everyone. He ordered a block split, then another, then a prow chipped like a raptor's beak. He worked fast, confident strokes. Stone answered in sparks. The boat he shaped looked like a boast given form. Thick, blunt, proud of refusing to move. He sealed seams with resin and grit, hammered pegs of bronze into sockets he had gouged by force. He dragged it by ropes to the edge, leaving a raw groove in the earth that pleased him. Horus stood where reeds make a fringe, and watched water decide small things. He gathered wood, not flashy, light and well-seasoned, sycamore rib, tamarisk spine, papyrus skin, everything the river already knew how to carry. With Isis's quiet eye on the grain, he cut planks thin and true. He bent them with warmed water and patience, lashing with linen cord rubbed in resin until the knots felt like decisions that wouldn't fray. He pressed powdered stone into a thin slip, smeared it over the hull, then burnished until the wood took on the dull, honest look of rock left in shade. He spoke to Thoth without raising his head. Not deception, presentation. It floats because it should. Set snorted. Paint won't save you. He gripped his stone boat's rim with both hands, arms swelling, and shoved. The granite kissed the surface, hesitated, then chose gravity. It went down like a sentence ending. Water rose quick, surprised, then smoothed itself, embarrassed for him. The prow bobbed once, then vanished. Set's jaw set harder. He threw a coil of rope after it, as if contempt could pull mass back. Horus slid his boat in with a touch that felt like apology to the bank. The hull sat light, accepting, the full stone skin dull under sun, believable enough to satisfy the rule of the eye, honest enough to satisfy the rule of the heart. He stepped aboard with weight distributed the way a heron distributes it, measured even. The boat dipped, then steadied. The river approved. Thoth raised a hand. Begin. Horus poled once, twice, the blade barely breaking the surface. The hull moved straight, leaving a wake so thin it looked like a thought deciding, and then continuing. Set waded out, furious, water lapping his thighs, then his waist, as if anger could become buoyancy. It doesn't. He shouted something harsh that the river chose not to repeat. Halfway across, a breeze tested the claim. Horus shifted a foot and let his knees carry the correction. The boat answered by not arguing. He passed the mid-channel mark where currents fold like hands. He kept his body soft around a strong spine. The far pole with the knotted cord waited. Ordinary. Inevitable. On the bank, Isis held the hawk feather against her palm. She breathed like someone matching a friend's pace. Nephthys's gaze stayed on the waterline, not the finish. Ra watched with the stillness of noon on a stone. Ma'at's feather lay untroubled. Horus reached the far shore and touched the pole with the gentlest tap. The sound barely existed. Thoth spoke it into record. Crossed, upright. Set stood dripping, granite pride heavy, eyes hard as the thing that failed him. Ra didn't smile. Seen, he said again. The river released its held breath, the deception of Isis. After contests measured craft and strength, the air grew thick with talk again, and in talk, Set hid knives. Isis chose another tool, not force, not counsel, a veil. She left the hall at dusk and returned to the edge where markets thin into road. There, she became a traveller's daughter, face unremarkable, eyes bright with a small sorrow, linen plain, anklets that chimed just enough to suggest a story worth hearing. She plaited her hair loosely and dusted it with barley flour so the scent would be homely, not holy. A beauty that says safe. Set liked to walk alone when victory felt delayed. He took long strides that dared dust to keep up. He saw the maiden by a tamarisk, head bowed over a cracked jar, and paused because power sometimes wants to be the one who fixes small things. Your jar, he said, chin lifting toward it. She looked up with a mixture of relief and caution taught to women by long roads. It leaks at the seam, she said, voice carrying the soft rattle of sleep not yet earned. I've walked far, Lord. The well is close, but my water won't last the turn. He reached for the vessel and felt the seam with a thumb trained to read stone, not clay. Heat it. Press the lip back. Even a poor pot can serve if its owner is strict. She nodded. Gratitude modest. Attention exactly where his pride needed it. She did not name him. She let him enjoy being unnamed, and still obeyed. Tell me, she asked, as they walked toward a brazier the market hands had left warm. In your lands, how do men treat theft? If a stranger takes a herdsman's ewe, keeps it, claims it as his own, what would justice say? Set smiled, teeth like small polished blades. Simple. The lamb goes back to the herdsman. Everyone knows it. Even fools consent when the case is put without smoke. She kept pace, jaw tilted toward the heat. And if a man kills his brother, takes the house and fields, and when the brother's son is born, refuses to release a single measure of grain, saying, "Because I hold, it is mine," what then? Set's eyes narrowed, but the framing pleased him. He liked cases that could be broken as easily as the jar in his hand. The son inherits, of course. Blood speaks louder than convenience. A thief of kinship courts curses. He wiped dust from the jar's rim with his palm, made a show of care. She lowered her gaze, lashes making a shade where thoughts could gather. You're sharp, Lord. I've seen others twist such things into wreaths of words. You cut through. He liked the cut through. He straightened, shoulders widening in the forgiving dusk. I do. The brazier's coals orange red. She pressed the jar to their glow. Clay softened. She pushed the seam back with a wrapped stick and bound it with a cord of damp reed. Set watched, approving craft that did not praise itself. What's your name? He asked. One that fits, she said, and smiled. He let it be a riddle and enjoyed not solving it. When the seam held, she dipped, filled, and held the jar up. No drip. She tested with a small tilt. Still no drip. You've helped me, she said. Let me pay with a story you can use. He pretended reluctance. She kept going. A man once put his brother in a chest, sealed it, threw it into the river, then tore him and scattered him when the wife made a path for restoration. He now argues that the throne he stole fits him better because he's broad in the shoulders. She lifted the jar to drink. Water made her pause at a clean angle. What should be done? Set's laugh began, then stalled on a grain of grit called memory. He chose bravado over caution. If a man did that, he'd confess himself a criminal in any court worth paper. He'd be forced to return what isn't his and count himself lucky to eat dust instead of chains. He liked the sound. He didn't notice Thoth, at the edge of the market, set his stylus. Isis's eyes, still the maiden's, lifted past Set's shoulder. The hall had emptied into evening. Some gods walk where people are to measure worlds by smaller rooms. Hathor lingered by a stall of figs. Ninth tested a bowstring with 2 fingers. They heard, words do not vanish in air built by law. She made no flourish. Thank you, she said simply. May the road treat you as fairly as you treat clarity. She turned, jaw steady on her hip, anklets a soft tally of steps. Set watched her go, pleased with himself for being wise in a public way. Then realization moved like a cold line across hot stone. He looked back and found Isis where the maiden had been a breath before. Same stance, same jaw, but the veil gone from the gaze. He saw the hawk feather in her hand, small, patient, exact. He felt the quiet of witnesses. Pride lurched and reached for anger as a cloak. Anger arrived thin. You tricked me, he said, voice low. Isis didn't step in or away. I asked a question, she answered, even. You loved the sound of your own law. Thoth wrote the last line on the tablet and blew a breath that dried ink without haste. Set's face set, and the desert inside him rose. He showed teeth that had bitten storms. Words are nothing, he hissed. Rivers and blood decide. Ra's shadow fell long and cooled the ground between them. We've heard enough, Ra said, voice unheated. Truth was invited. It came. The market and the gods within it held the silence that follows a confession shaped like a boast. The final battle. Morning arrived without a crown. The plain between river and desert held a ring of stones, simple, round, enough to say, here and nowhere else. The gods stood at the rim, their shadows long and thin, their faces unreadable. Ra raised a hand once. Wind quieted. No drums. No war paint. Two figures stepped into the circle with the stillness that comes when there's nothing left to argue. Horus carried no spear. He wore the feather over his heart and the memory of water in his stance. Set's hands were empty too, but his shoulders spoke of storms. They looked at each other the way old trees do, measuring, accepting age and root. They began with breath. Horus moved first, a small step right, testing space. Set answered with a forward lean, sand crunching softly. A rush, a sidestep, palm to forearm, forearm to shoulder, each touch a sentence, short and clear. Set drove power like a wedge. Horus let it pass and returned a flat, steady palm that redirected without insult. Their feet drew lines in dust that the ring understood. Minutes became their own kind of time. Set advanced in waves, big, deliberate. Horus bent around each, not breaking, not retreating far, hands shaping air into answers. Set lunged for the throat. Horus lowered the chin and caught wrist to elbow, turned, released. Set kicked. Horus let contact glancing, closed distance, then opened it like a door. Strength met structure. Noise did not grow. When force alone didn't tip the field, Set called heat. The air around him shivered, a mirage of temper. He swelled into the shadow of the red beast that walked storms. Horus narrowed, spine long, eyes falcon sharp. He didn't match bulk, he matched intent. He shifted his weight the way a reed shifts under a gust, knees soft, spine true. The charge didn't knock him down. It slid past, heavy and surprised. Set's breath grew louder. Horus's stayed even. They turned, traded, tested. A throw almost landed, sand cushioned. A grip almost closed. Sweat made honesty. On the rim, Ninth's fingers relaxed. Hathor's gaze warmed. Thoth's stylus moved slow, recording not triumph, pattern. At last, Horus saw it. A habit Set couldn't hide. The left foot that overreached when anger climbed. He didn't pounce. He placed. Step, pivot, hand at elbow, hand at hip. A small arc that brings large bodies to ground without insult. Set stumbled, shoulders finding dust. Breath whooshing once. Horus didn't follow with hardness. He knelt one knee, one hand at Set's wrist, one at the shoulder. Pressure clean, controllable. Yield, he said, voice level. Set bucked, pride tossing sparks. Horus waited. Yield, he said again, exactly the same. On the rim, Ra's shadow lengthened. Anger fought, then tired. Set grew still. He looked up at the sky he knew so well. He exhaled. I yield, he said. Not loud, not whisper. A fact given. Horus released as if easing a knot, not snapping rope. He stepped back. He offered a hand. Set stared at it, then took it and rose, dusting his palms with a flick that didn't quite hide respect. The ring exhaled with them. Isis's eyes softened. The feather over Horus's heart lay quiet, untroubled by beats that stayed slow. He stood, not taller, clearer. Set rolled his shoulders as if finding a new shape inside an old name. No chains appeared. No cheers broke. The gods watched balance settle like a bowl set on level ground. The battle ended the way good work ends. Clean, without splinters. The wrath of Horus. Silence held the ring after Set's yielding. It should have been enough. Balance had spoken. But something old and hot rose in Horus like a coal that had waited under ash too long. He saw the chest. He saw the scattering. He saw the marsh nights where whispering had to replace names. He saw his mother's hands learning mending that should never have been needed. Mercy, even measured, felt like a door left unbarred in a wind that eats houses. Isis stepped towards Set, palm open, the way she approaches a frightened bird to keep it from breaking itself on a wall. "Let him rise with his name intact," she said softly. "Order holds better when humiliation doesn't drip into the corners." Her voice was a cool cloth. Her eyes were steady as night water. She offered rope that could have bound him without knots. She offered the kind of mercy that keeps a floor from tilting. To Horus, it looked like the world swallowing the cost that had blood in it. The coal broke. He moved before thinking had a chance to return. A sharp step, a hand like a blade through linen. In one breath, anger shaped itself into an action that couldn't be taken back. He struck, quick as a falcon's strike at a snake's head. The blow wasn't wild. It was precise in the worst way, aimed at the source of gentleness he feared would dissolve justice. Isis staggered, not from pain. Gods carry hurt differently, but from the recognition of her son's rage. Her head fell as if sleep had called it. In the space between heartbeats, Thoth's presence unfolded like a page turning itself. He lifted his hand, and the wound became a hinge. He set a cow's head, sacred, serene, upon her neck, not as mockery, as protection, as a lesson that nurturance is not less than power. It is another face of it. The new brow held patience broader than the first. The large, calm eyes gathered anger and gave none back. Horus froze, breath caught halfway to apology. The ring seemed to tilt, then right itself. He saw what he had done as if from the far bank of the river where clarity stands. His hand lowered. The hawk feather over his heart did not move, but he felt it grow heavy. "Mother," he said, the word an old child's word coming through a grown mouth. Isis breathed once, deep, the way fields breathe at flood. "Justice without mercy eats its own tongue," she said. The cow's voice gentle, full, unafraid. "Mercy without justice wets the floor until everyone slips. We walk between." She reached and touched his cheek with a palm that forgave, without pretending nothing had happened. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's choosing the next step. Horus bowed his head. The heat inside him cooled into something he could warm his hands by, not burn the house with. He turned to Set, not with triumph now, with a steadier truth. "You're bound by law, not by my anger," he said. Set's eyes flicked to Isis, to the calm brow that wouldn't be shaken, then back to Horus. He found no foothold for mockery. He found a wall that didn't need to shout to stand. Thoth closed his stylus. "Recorded," he murmured. Ra's shadow eased. The ring released its breath, and in that soft exhale, mother and son stood close enough for a lesson to settle and stay, the judgment of Ra. The ring stood quiet, the dust settling as if it too waited for a word that would set weight where it belonged. Ra stepped forward without hurry. Light gathered, not harsh, the kind that lets eyes rest while seeing everything. Thoth opened his scroll to a fresh line. Ma'at's feather lay calm, its shadow thin and straight. Ra's gaze passed over Set, over Horus, then paused on Isis with the serene brow that had absorbed a blow without hardening. He saw all of it: contest, confession, restraint, the slip into wrath, the repair. He lifted his hand. The quiet deepened until even sand forgot to rub. Strength was tested, he said, voice level, old as the first shore. Craft was tested. Truth was invited and answered. Anger showed itself, then learned a smaller step. He turned the palm of his hand toward the feather. Now we weigh. Thoth moved like accuracy moving. He placed the feather on one scale, a heart on the other. Not a red muscle, a bright measure of intent, the sum of a name. Horus stepped close, not proud, not pleading, and let the scale read him. The bowl dipped and rose, found a balance point that did not tremble. Thoth made a small mark. He turned, and Set held his place, jaw set, eyes daring the device to call him hollow. The bowl bearing his name lowered, touched bottom, rose a finger's breadth, then settled a little heavy. Not doom, a truth that didn't wear perfume. Ra nodded, not to punish, to recognize. Horus, he said, and the name became a path. You are the rightful king of the living. You will sit the throne your father steadied. You will carry the crook and flail not as whips, as reminders. Guide and measure. Your rule will ask the river to remember its promise and the fields their patience. Horus bowed with the brevity that respects both giver and gift. The hawk feather over his heart lay flat. Isis exhaled, shoulders loosening, the lesson of mercy rising like cool air after heat. Ra turned to Set. You are not unmade, he said. Chaos doesn't vanish when law speaks. It learns its room. He pointed toward the wide red line of horizon, where sand becomes sky, and storms train their backs. You will take the desert and the upper air. You will roar where ships need warning. You will break what grows rotten at the root. You will not cross the Nile without summons. In your violence, serve. Set's mouth thinned, a line that tasted sour truth and chose not to spit it out. He inclined his head once, a nod that agreed with boundaries he would test but not topple. The gods around the ring let out a breath that sounded like fabric settling. Ra raised both hands. Order isn't stone, he said. It's a reed boat. It floats because it yields, because it's tied with care, because a straight gaze guides it. He looked at Horus. You will be straight. He looked at Set. You will be strong in the right place. He looked at Isis. You will be the quiet that keeps both from forgetting bread and water and sleep. Thoth rolled the scroll with a click soft as a bead. Recorded, he murmured. Ma'at's feather shone a shade brighter, not from pride, from alignment. Hathor smiled like shade at noon. Night's fingers rested easy on the bow she didn't need to lift. Ra lowered his hands. Go, he said simply. Fields wait, winds wait, the dead wait their judge, the living wait their keeper. We don't stay in rings, we walk our roads. He turned, and light folded itself, becoming day again, not decree. Horus stepped out of the circle with a pace the land would learn. Set walked toward the pale line of desert, shoulders rolling like thunder choosing a distant valley. Isis's palm found her son's arm. Brief, sure. Balance didn't sing. It held, the kingdom of the Duat. Night opens a second Egypt. Beneath the river runs a river that remembers more. The Duat isn't a pit. It's a landscape of truth. Fields, gates, lakes where silence has a skin. Paths wind onto stars that don't move. There, Osiris sits, not as a ghost, as a king, who learned steadiness the hard way and kept it. His hall is long, lit by lamps that burn with oils pressed from memory. Pillars wear lotus and papyrus the way the Nile wears seasons. On the far end, a great scale stands quiet until a soul approaches. Anubis, patient as he was on the banks above, tends the balance, adjusting nothing, watching everything. Thoth records, stylus ticking like a calm heart. Mayat's feather lies on one pan, light as a breath that told no lies. They come in twos of silence, the newly dead and the story they've carried, condensed to a heart. Not meat meaning, the weight of choices. Osiris doesn't thunder. He listens. He looks with eyes that have known being whole and being broken. He raises a hand, and the weighing begins. Anubis sets the heart on the other pan. Sometimes it rises quick, relieved of quarrel. Sometimes it sinks, dragged by knots that weren't untied in time. The feather never changes. That's its work. Thoth notes the tilt without malice. Decision arrives without drama. If the heart balances, gates open into the field of reeds, a horizon where work fits the hand, and harvests happen when they should. Barley grows shoulder high, not to boast, to feed. Families walk together with no shoes needed. Boats glide in shallow water that holds the sky like careful glass. The sun moves, but softly, and Ra's bark passes overhead each night, touching the river below with steady gold. If the heart proves heavy with what devours, Amit waits, a mouth made of 3 warnings, patient and implacable. No dungeon, no whip, just an end. The soul becomes silence. Even judgment in the Duat respects the land above by not sending rot back to it. Osiris speaks rarely. When he does, it's to remind the room that balance isn't an opinion. His voice is low, the way deep water is low, holding much, spilling none. He looks at those who pass into the fields as a farmer looks at well-cut grain. He looks at those who don't as a craftsman looks at a cracked vessel. Sadness without anger. Then the next case. Ra's nightly journey threads through this province of order. Each evening he enters the western gate, and the Duat brightens like a temple when lamps are lit. He greets Osiris with a nod that needs no words. Day honors night, life honors death. They aren't enemies. They trade duties. Ra sails on, facing serpents that rise from dark water, Apep twisting jaws wide. The crew stands ready, spells steady hands. Knives meet coils. The bark passes. Dawn is purchased again. In this kingdom, right action above keeps the lanes below smooth. Offerings sent in clean bowls arrive. Names spoken with love sound like small bells. Families feel each other across the bend of the world and know it matters. Osiris rules with the patience of crops, the seriousness of law, the mercy that recognizes repair when it's real. The Duat isn't far. It runs alongside, quiet, exact, waiting like a shore you will reach by a road you're already on.